host, Alana Sibin. So it's Monday, October 12th. There are 22 days remaining before the election. This is a show about the possibility that the will of the people and the voters could be disrupted, set aside, and stolen this year. And we're going to keep talking about this subject matter every single day until the election has come to pass and we've hopefully saved our democracy. So, Alana, can you tell our audience about who we have joining us today?
Yes, as you know, if you joined us before, Bart Gellman recently reported on information leaked from inside the Republican Party about some of the anti-democratic tactics that are being used. And today, to talk a little bit more about that, we'll be talking with Professor Lawrence Douglas, a professor of law at Amherst College and author of Will He Go? So, Professor Douglas, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
My pleasure to be with you.
So in your book, you spell out the ways that authoritarian figures like Vladimir Putin manipulate the electoral process, I don't know what that is, the electoral process to suit their will. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your background studying the behavior of autocrats with regard to elections.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's emerged in this phenomenon that we now call illiberal democracies is the idea that rather than, let's say, dispensing with elections altogether, what you find these authoritarians, these kind of contemporary authoritarians doing is basically using the democratic practice as a way of kind of nominally legitimating their rule. And so they actually conduct elections, but the elections are, in some sense, have a foregone conclusion. And there are, many, many things that a well-heeled authoritarian can do to make sure that the election simply confirms or reestablishes their power. They can do everything from, well, actually something that looks like Trump is now kind of borrowing a page from the playbook is it's very standard practice to for an authoritarian to turn a political opponent into an enemy and then an enemy into a criminal, and to basically try to find, to create some kind of bogus prosecution. It could be about misappropriation of funds. There are all sorts of ways to kind of rig the voting process. There are all sorts of ways to rig the counting process. There are all sorts of ways to intimidate the opponents of voters from voting, to sponsor violence on the streets. We've seen in the case of Putin's Russia, the willingness to kind of assassinate or try to assassinate political opponents. So there's a whole kind of pretty rich and imaginative playbook out there for these authoritarians who kind of nominally use the electoral process, but basically do it without being actually dedicated to democratic outcomes.
It's interesting that you bring that up because in your book, you talk specifically about how Trump is a weak authoritarian. So could you talk a little bit more about what that means and how that prevents him from being able to, go full Putin?
Yeah, exactly. That stop going full Putin is exactly right. So, I do think by calling him weak authoritarian, I don't mean that his instincts are any kind of less authoritarian. It seems like Trump's instincts really are quite, authoritarian and quite dangerous. If you look at kind of your standard authoritarians around the world, they usually try to cultivate very strong ties with their military and with their intelligence services. And one of the kind of extraordinary qualities of Trump's rule is that I think it's fair to say that he has really alienated the military, certainly the higher echelons of the military in the United States. And I think it's probably fair to say that the overwhelming majority of members of the intelligence community hold this guy in contempt and probably don't think of him as fit for service, that is fit to be president of the United States. And so that's one of the things that I think kind of weakens him as an authoritarian, the way in which, far from cultivating these strong ties with the military and the intelligence service, it seems like he's done everything under his power to alienate them. And if not in the case of the intelligence service, to actually disgrace them.
So shifting gears a little bit to the way we the people, are receiving information about what's going on here. You engaged in this really interesting conversation in the book where you talked about how the Trump media machine has essentially resulted in this sort of like schism in American, I guess, listeners, audiences, where, there was like a divorce and like some of us got the mainstream media, like the regular news that we had all along. And a lot of Trump's followers have had their ability to believe in the legitimacy of media undermined to the point where they now sort of only have him to rely on as an information source. And it struck me because it was so personal. It felt so abuse-like. It felt so cultish. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how we got here and what the result of that information divide will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of kind of likening it to an abusive relationship, I think, is a very, very interesting one. And, certainly it's the case that, Trump hasn't necessarily invented this problem, but I don't think it's fair to say that, he's simply kind of contributed to it. I think he has kind of raised the stakes by kind of a quantum level, that is, in terms of, poisoning the well of American discourse and our trust in, fact-finding institutions and media that can basically clarify to the American people, what's up and what is down. And he really has, I think, been very successful in poisoning the well. And I think, as you point out, he would not be able to do that if it weren't for this incredibly siloed media environment in which we live in. And even the siloed nature doesn't really capture the reality, because I've heard people say, well, on one hand you have Sean Hannity, on the other you have MSNBC, and it's like, what? How can you possibly draw an equivalence to that there's asymmetry involved there, and the Sean Hannitys of the world, they've kind of emerged almost as kind of like, we were just talking about Putin. It is almost like state-sponsored propaganda for the president, in which there's almost this feedback loop, and that the president hears things from Sean Hannity, repeats them back, and everything just becomes repeated and amplified. And I think if you spend some time just watching Sean Hannity or so, and if that were your only source of information in the world, you would probably believe a lot of the things that are coming out of that. And so to the extent that people just partake in that feedback loop or get their information from it, they're kind of insulated from the kind of real truth testing that a democracy requires.
God, that's so interesting and terrifying to continue thinking about. But looking at the other side of the media, you wrote that the Wolf Blitzers, John Kings, and Anderson Coopers of the world can be tutored to remind their viewers on Election Day that the results they announce are tentative, pending the count of absentee and provisional ballots. And I think there's been a lot of discussion of this. A lot of people are very much relying on the idea of sort of election season, not election day. Right. But what do you think it's going to take to really get the broader mainstream news outlets fully ready to cover the rhetoric and the sort of aggressive, like two-side sparring over what election day means? What does that tutoring that you talked about consist of?
Well, for one thing, I think it really does mean that, as soon as people tune in on November 3rd, let's say in the evening of November 3rd, when at least the people, when in-person polling starts to close, in-person voting starts to close, let's say on the East Coast, that immediately the announcers not treat this as if we're kind of watching the Super Bowl, which typically the way they treat, watching Election Day return.
It's the nerd Super Bowl. We know. We all love it. It's the nerd Super Bowl.
Exactly. It's the nerd Super Bowl. Exactly. With higher numbers than the normal Super Bowl. The normal Super Bowls, those numbers just don't get remotely as high. And I think they need to start reminding people, really from the get-go that this is probably going to be provisional. This is going to be, we're just going to see some results, provisional results that are being reported. The fact that we are not going to know who has been elected, possibly for days or even weeks, is not evidence that the system is somehow malfunctioning, that the system has been corrupted. It's the inevitable and perfectly healthy consequence of voting in a time of pandemic, and that in the interest of getting things right, we need to kind of wait until all these mail-in ballots are counted. And the other thing is, I think it's very important for them. They very often have these the various pundits and talking heads, sometimes from the Democratic Party, sometimes from the Republican Party. I think it's very important for them to curate who's going to be talking, because you want everyone to be on message. You want everyone to be reminding the viewers that, hey, you don't necessarily need to be watching tonight. It's not something they really want, a message they really want to send out.
Got to get the news to tell people not to watch.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, exactly. But, to watch in a different spirit, in a kind of spirit of, it's not the Super Bowl. It's not the Kentucky Derby. We're not waiting to see who wins the race. It's more like, kind of a regular news evening. And even to have people, talking about how things are likely to play out in the coming days and even weeks, just to kind of maintain the confidence that the American people need to have in the electoral system.
So I want to jump in and talk a little about the year 2000. In your book, you talk a lot about how Al Gore conceded without using all of his legal options. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, but specifically, I'm going to ask us to play a really quick clip from his concession speech, and then I'll come back to you to talk a little bit more about it.
The court has spoken. Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
So can you take us a little bit through that decision and what it said about the reliance of our system on the norms and decency that we have here?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's a pretty remarkable thing that we just saw Al Gore do. I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that it was the Supreme Court that brought, necessary closure to that election dispute in the year 2000. And recall, the Supreme Court didn't intervene until about, I think, 35 days after the nation had gone to the polls, and everything was turning on the vote in Florida. And the Supreme Court basically stopped the Florida recount with George W. Bush clinging to a 537 vote lead, which gave him the White House. I mean, 537 votes is, out of 6 million cast in Florida, it's a ridiculously minuscule margin. And, I think people who thought, well, even if the Supreme Court's decision was partisan, even if it was pretty poorly reasoned, at least it brought closure. And I think what that clip reminds us is that it wasn't the court that brought us closure. It was Al Gore himself. And in conceding and accepting this kind of really pretty bad decision by the US Supreme Court, I think what Gore demonstrated was a willingness to subordinate his own political fortunes for the good of the nation. And that really is, and I'm not saying that Gore is necessarily an angelic human being for having done so. He might be. But I think what he demonstrated that night or that next day was that, he is a statesperson who had absorbed the norms of the system. And part of the norms of the system means, not playing constitutional brinkmanship if that's going to really damage the nation. And I think it's fair to say, whatever else we might say about Donald Trump, it's impossible to imagine him acting in a similar fashion under those circumstances.
So I'm wondering if you think if Joe Biden is placed in a similar situation in this upcoming election, where it shows that he might be winning, but we know that Trump is not going to concede by any means, what should Joe Biden do? And do you think that Al Gore, in that scenario, made a mistake
I don't think Al Gore necessarily made a mistake. I mean, it probably is the case that the Republican, I mean, I think if you study what was going on at that time, the Republican legal teams were definitely willing to play hardball in a way that the Democrats simply were not willing to do so. And, but, I do think at that time, even if, let's say in retrospect, we recognize that George W. Bush's presidency was a very bad presidency and kind of unhealthy for the country. I think at the time it was, in a sense, still what we might describe as an ordinary election between Republicans and Democrats. And that's what I think probably fueled Al Gore's decision. There's nothing particularly ordinary about this election. And, I think as Barack Obama mentioned or said during the Democratic National Convention through Zoom, in many ways our democracy is at stake here. The stakes are much, much higher. And, I think it's been reported Republicans have seized on the fact that Hillary Clinton said to Biden or advised him not to concede as suggesting that, well, just as Trump isn't willing to concede, nor is Biden going to concede. And again, there's a complete misquotation of what Hillary Clinton said. What she said was he shouldn't concede until every vote is counted. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I don't think that that we can afford as a nation to reward Trump for playing, constitutional brinkmanship and trying to kind of muddy the waters of his defeat. And I think that it's essential for Vice President Biden to basically exhaust every possible thing he can do through legal means, legal channels, and political channels to make sure that Trump doesn't try to, in a sense, so muddy the waters that he can claim a victory when in fact he has suffered a defeat.
It seems also like the least Joe Biden can do, if you're going to ask millions of people to vote for you, being willing to stick it out until their votes are counted, kind of seems like the bare minimum, I guess. But okay, so turning away from Al Gore for a second, turning away from 2000, going to 2016, you described Trump's perspective in 2016 in your book in this way that really put me in mind of his reality show character more than a presidential candidate. This idea that he wasn't expecting to win, that defeat in 2016 was a victory for him. He would get an entire news network out of it. He would have this big career bump. Like, it would be very beneficial for him to have run and lost. However, in 2020, we have a situation where he can't similarly preserve or even increase his brand by losing. He has to win. This is a must-win election for the Trump brand. And I want to sort of, I was reading this part of the book, and I couldn't help but wonder if last time, Trump didn't think he was going to win last time, but perhaps this time his gestures toward sort of arcane forms of electoral theft are in fact part of that brand, right? To seem like a tough competitor, the kind of competitor who will use 19th century law to set aside people's electors and force his allies in Republican-held states to sort of subvert this election. So I'm wondering if you think there's any chance that all of the stuff we're frightened of right now could be part of a face-saving attempt, or do you see this as a really honest plan to go through with something extreme? And does that ultimately matter?
Well, certainly it matters if he's going to go through with something extreme. That would be very, very unhappy for our nation, I think it's fair to say. And, I think the business about the face saving, the peculiar thing about this president is, face saving and brand promotion seems to be his chief political end. So it's not as if you can kind of separate out kind of what his real political purpose is from his desire to protect and to promote the brand. And I do think, let's say he loses very, very decisively. And by decisively, of course, we can't simply mean in the popular vote. It has to mean in the electoral college vote. It has to mean in the swing states. And it probably also means that we have to know that relatively quickly, like maybe not on November 3rd, but let's say within several days, we get the sense that this is going to be a very, very decisive win for Biden. Under those circumstances, I still think Trump will insist that the election has been rigged. I can't imagine him ever conceding in the sense that he would recognize that in a fair fight, he lost to a worthy opponent. Can't imagine him doing it. I just don't think it's in his DNA. Go back to the 2016 Iowa caucus. He loses to Ted Cruz. The very next day, he's out tweeting saying, I didn't lose. Cruz stole the caucus. Results should be overturned. Hoax. That said, if he does lose very decisively, I think he will have to submit to defeat. And that will be, in a certain way, a way in protecting the brand. Look, the election was stolen from me, but we all know that the radical Dems have been aligned against me from day one. So there's really nothing more I can do except to submit to defeat. But if it is the case that the election starts to turn on the late count of mail-in ballots in a handful of swing states, then I think his brand protection scheme is not just going to be mere rhetoric. I think it will be a very, very concerted effort to muddy the waters in order to claim victory.
And you talk a lot about how recent polling shows that Republicans are deeply distrustful of election integrity. And so I'm curious, where do these fears come from? Do they have any sort of basis in fact? And can you talk about how the sort of cultivation of these fears goes into the broader Republican strategy to undermine confidence in elections?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's sort of a little disturbing about polls is they demonstrate that both sides now have worries about the integrity of, the electoral system. But here again, I would point out, to an asymmetry. When Democratic voters express concern about, let's say, a Republican tactics of voter suppression, well, there's a reality there. I mean, there are facts there that they can point to. I mean, voter suppression is really kind of a staple of Democratic politics, particularly trying to suppress the Black vote in specific in the United States, and also some other minority, ethnic groups. When it comes to Republican voters, this idea that the mail-in ballots have been or are susceptible to some massive corruption, well, that's basically just kind of baseless rumor. I mean, you have Trump's own director of the FBI coming forward and saying there's no reason to believe that there's any kind of concerted effort on the part of the Democrats to contaminate mail-in ballots. I mean, logically, there's no reason to do so, since the mail-in ballots are going to break overwhelmingly Democratic anyway. So it is very, very concerning. And in terms of the kind of the genesis of this, let's say, Republican and specific distrust of the electoral system, I think you always found that on the fringes of, let's say, right-wing groups, among conspiracy theorists, and Donald Trump has aggressively mainstreamed these kinds of these rumors, and it's this whole business of kind of poisoning the well, just as he's kind of poisoned the well with regards to our faith in sources of independent information in this country. He's kind of poisoned the well about our belief in the integrity of the electoral system, or at least the belief among his supporters.
So, Professor Douglas, we're coming close to the end of our time, but I have a very big last question for you.
I love big last questions.
Oh, good. Then we're on the same page. Right. in our last show, we covered sort of the intricacies of the Electoral Count Act and these ways in which the will of the voters might be to elect Joe Biden, but Republican local elected officials could literally just set aside the will of the voters and send competing slates of electors to vote in the Electoral College. So for anyone watching this show now being like, what are you talking about? You should totally watch our last episode, which you can restream, and it's awesome and you will learn everything. But we're talking about this with you. We're talking about this on pretty much every episode. It's really frightening, but there's a very limited number of people talking about these possibilities, which are concrete and completely based in law, and not, as you say, like based in the fantasy of mail-in ballots being wonky, but really based in things that have happened before and things that could happen again and are quite logical. But, you know, and obviously our audience is watching this because they're interested in it. If they're interested in it and we're talking about it, and very reasonable, esteemed scholars like yourself think this is quite plausible, why is this not on the nightly news? Why are we not hearing more about this? And do you think people are not taking these threats to our process seriously enough?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, maybe this is also just the way the news cycle works, is the news is, it's about things that typically have happened. It's not things that could happen prospectively. And, it's very hard to get people to really, really take seriously threats that are looming that haven't happened. Once they happen, then people take these things very, very seriously. But up until that moment, it's like, well, it's speculative, could happen, might not happen. Maybe we'll dodge the bullet. We'll have to see. We have to wait and see. So I do think it's incredibly important for us to take this very, very seriously. Now, I suppose the question is, what can we do in taking this seriously? Is there anything we can do? Or is this kind of like a train wreck in slow motion that we kind of know something bad's going to happen and we just kind of sit there watching going like, oh, well, there's the train coming. Uh-oh, the tracks look a little broken there. Oops, there goes the train. And, I do think there are some things that we can do. They might be obvious things, but I think if you are going to vote, I think it's essential to vote. If you're voting by mail-in ballot, make sure you mail in that ballot very early. So, one of the reasons for disqualifying mail-in ballots is if they're submitted in an untimely fashion. We know that Trump has tried to understaff and underfund the USPS in order to basically make sure that these ballots are disqualified. So mail it in early. If you're voting in person, there are many states that permit in-person voting well before Election Day. And that's a way of minimizing the risk associated with in-person voting on Election Day itself. Join citizens groups that monitor polling places and voting places to make sure that there aren't groups trying to intimidate voters, Trump supporters who are trying to intimidate people from exercising their right of franchise. And I think, try to get that message out to as many people as possible, because I think that, as I said earlier, I think our best chance of avoiding a real crisis is to hand Trump a decisive defeat.
Oh, man. Well, thank you. I'll be voting early in person. And Professor Douglas, thank you so much for joining us, for terrifying us, for leaving us here to stew in our own juices about whether the election and climate change are actually the same kind of helpless slow motion train wreck. But we really appreciate you and your work. Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure to be with you, Emily. Thanks so much again, Alana and Emily. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wow. So as we've learned, we're living in a completely different informational world from Trump, and that the result of this could be a world where the majority of Americans are horrified by the legal battle following the election, but are powerless to stop it.
Yep, which actually really brings me back to where we started. It sounds dramatic to say that Trump is an aspiring autocrat or an authoritarian working on a sort of slow motion coup. But when we talk with scholars like Professor Douglas, when we hear, from Bart Gellman, it starts to feel like that which previously was outlandish is actually very reasonable.
And, you know, that actually, I'm glad you say that because it brings us nicely to our next topic, which is the authoritarian actions that are already happening in the streets through voter intimidation by Trump supporters to subvert the will of voters. This is a central part of Trump's strategy to steal this election. You know, to be clear, the GOP have been and are masters of voter suppression. They've spent decades restricting the vote and voting power of those who tend to vote Democratic.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking a lot about this because it's like when Donald Trump makes claims about Democrats interfering with the election, which, as Professor Douglas just told us, like have no basis in fact, but it's always about too many people getting a voice. It's like, you know, they're letting illegal aliens vote, his terminology, not mine, but it's that kind of thing, right? The people who don't look to him like they should be voting are voting. And for us, you know, when we talk about voter suppression, and I have to say, when we look at these instances of voter suppression that are very much based in fact that you can see around the country, it's all about silencing people, right? Purging voter rolls, or, you know, creating so few polling places that there are lines wrapping around the corner, refusal to make Election Day a national holiday, you know, putting rules in place that make it much harder to vote, especially if you are poor or Black or brown or voting in a blue district. And, you know, I was thinking back on the 2016 election when Donald Trump claimed that he would have won the popular vote, but there were these like mysterious 3 to 5 million undocumented people who he claimed without any proof voted. And so he just, you know, told White House officials to back up this claim. And he told weird stories. Like he told a story about German golfer Bernhard Langer waiting in line to vote, which is very weird because Bernhard Langer is a German citizen, not a US citizen, and therefore like actually cannot vote in our elections. And he talks about Bernhard Langer standing in line at this polling place on election day and being told correctly that he's not eligible to vote. But according to Donald Trump, there were other voters in line who, the quote is, I think, who did not look as if they should be allowed to vote. What does that look like? But who were nonetheless permitted to cast provisional ballots. And the president then reportedly, you know, threw out the names of Latin American countries that he supposed these voters came from. And sort of just like this game of racist telephone that is presented as evidence of voter fraud. But what it's really about is this belief that people who don't look like you should be silenced and should not have the right to have a political say in the future of our nation, which, like, when I fall back on my, like, you know, Iowan patriotic upbringing, it's just horrifying to me that there would even be a sector of the country that wants to silence their friends and neighbors.
Right. I mean, and let's be clear, widespread voter fraud is not a thing. In Douglas's book, for example, he notes that between 2000 and 2014, only 31 cases of impersonation fraud have been documented in over 1 billion votes cast in the United States. Meanwhile, there are other real forms of voter interference that have been documented, including widespread misinformation campaigns waged with the aid of Russia, outlined in the Mueller report. But this administration, with the aid of disingenuous elected officials like Chris Kobach, decided to put together a Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity in 2017 to focus specifically on voter fraud, a problem that does not exist. The goal of this commission and other efforts was to launder bogus claims of voter fraud and give them an air of credibility so that the GOP could justify all of these sorts of voter ID laws and other laws that prevent low-income people from voting. And so we're going to show you a clip or an image of a Trump tweet from the 2018 midterm elections. It says, "Law enforcement has been strongly notified to watch closely for any illegal voting which may take place in Tuesday's election or early voting. Anyone caught will be subject to the maximum criminal penalties allowed by law." Now, again, we know that widespread illegal voting isn't a real threat. But these sorts of efforts aren't actually designed to prevent voter fraud. Douglas sums it up really nicely in his book when he says that the idea that police and ICE agents will be widely dispatched for looking suspicious or for looking for suspicious voters can only serve to discourage persons of color from voting. And this particularly is going to impact naturalized citizens of Latinx heritage out of fear from being harassed by Trump supporters and law enforcement.
There's almost too much to talk about here. Because we want in this moment to talk about, the people who might show up in person to be intimidating at the polls. But honestly, someone tweeted earlier today that long lines are voter suppression. And it really is true. There's all of these other mechanisms of intimidation and barriers that can be thrown up, all of which the GOP historically, Chris Kobach perhaps in particular, has attempted to use to take away your ability. Even if you have the right to vote, it's an attempt to take away your ability. But today the focus is on authoritarianism, autocratic theme of the day. And so we want to focus on the human intimidation at the polls. What is more authoritarian than asking people to go on your behalf to polling places to try and frighten legitimate voters into not voting? So in the spirit of the president's request to stand back and stand by, let's take a dive into history. Alana, I keep claiming that the GOP has done this before. Can you back me up and talk about how the GOP has done this before?
Absolutely. Let's go back to the 1980s because it really shapes what Trump and the GOP can and cannot do in this election cycle when it comes to quote unquote poll watching, which is a voter intimidation strategy for them. In 1981, the Republican National Committee helped orchestrate one of the most overt voter intimidation efforts America has ever seen. Together with New Jersey Republicans, the RNC hired off-duty sheriffs and police officers who wore revolvers and National Ballot Security Task Force armbands to patrol Black and Latinx communities, successfully turning away voters from the polls.
But this was actually illegal, and a judge said so, and this got banned by the courts, right?
The Democratic National Committee sued the RNC, and a federal court issued a consent decree to curb the RNC's voter intimidation tactics. And, the judge oversaw the terms of that consent decree.
Okay, but in the years since, Republicans did violate that decree. And they did violate it repeatedly, so the decree kept getting extended. It's sort of like my kid's timeout. She keeps breaking the timeout. I put her back in timeout. The timeout gets longer. But this actually only lasted until 2018, because in 2018, that judge's order expired. And so during this election season, for the first time in many, 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 many years, there is no longer an order preventing this type of in-person intimidation. The RNC is now free once again to engage in these ballot security efforts without a grown-up in the room, without judicial oversight. So the result, the Trump campaign is recruiting with videos and all kinds of media, what Republicans are calling an army of poll watchers. Poll watcher seems like a really milquetoast term for it, but people to go to the polls and, in the words of the president, to watch very carefully.
Right. And this sort of poll watching isn't like, folks coming with lanyards and clipboards to make sure that they can troubleshoot all of these different things that come up with voting. It's designed voter intimidation. It's starting. And over the weekend, there was a story in the LA Times that features white militia groups who are pledging to poll watch. But for them, that means showing up with military style gear and guns, looking intimidating and looking for trouble outside of polling stations.
So I think what's really shocking when we talk about these groups, like, yes, there are ad hoc people who show up, which is actually maybe functionally just as bad. But what's really shocking is that the groups we're talking about are like groups that have been identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as dangerous hate groups. I mean, we want to highlight 3 of these groups, all of whom want the same thing, right? Which is to create an atmosphere of violence and chaos. And as we know, chaos surrounding the actual casting of ballots, chaos at the polling place, chaos of any kind strengthens the Trump campaign's ability to subsequently claim that the vote is flawed. So what I mean to say by that is chaos, even if it's chaos created by the Trump campaign at the behest of the Trump campaign by SPLC, named groups that are dangerous, that chaos still helps them because they're able to say, oh, we don't know, whether these votes are legitimate. And it helps them make the argument that separate electors should be appointed. We can kick off with the group that everybody has heard of, I think, by now, which is the Proud Boys, which is a male-only, far-right extremist group. They've pledged to show up even at ballot drop-off locations, which is really, really scary, especially in Oregon, which is like not a swing state, but it's the state that they are most focused on. And the Southern Poverty Law Center reported that, I'm going to quote here. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm reading on my screen. Their disavowals of bigotry are belied by their actions. Rank and file Proud Boys and leaders regularly spout white nationalist memes and maintain affiliations with known extremists. They are known for anti-Muslim and misogynistic rhetoric. Proud Boys have appeared alongside other hate groups at extremist gatherings like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which, Alana, as you recall, was a lethal event.
Right. And we also have the Oath Keepers. That's another one of these groups, which draws its membership primarily from thousands and thousands of former law enforcement officers and military personnel. The Southern Poverty Law Center labeled Oath Keepers one of the largest radical anti-government groups in the US today. After police officers shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Oath Keepers deployed to Ferguson in tactical gear and armed to the hilt. As the Southern Poverty Law Center notes, Oath Keepers said they went to Ferguson to protect businesses from rioters, but it seemed clear that they were really there for protecting white businesses, it seemed clear that they were really there to protect white businesses against Black protesters. In a recent article, the Atlantic noticed that Oath Keepers are recruiting thousands of people, soldiers, and veterans to, quote, fight for a new world order.
That's a really scary quote. I'm just going to put that fighting. That's a really scary quote. Just putting it out there.
Yeah. And, there's the Three Percenters, which is another far right-wing extremist movement, which has, as Reveal News recently put it, long been active around the fringes of white supremacist ecosystem. 3% comes from the idea that 3% of colonists overthrew British rule.
And yet there seems to be no action against the present government. This brings us actually to my, I don't want to say my favorite. I don't have a favorite of hate groups, of violent white supremacist hate groups. But this name, the Wolverine Watchmen, is, if it were a movie, might be a very different outcome. It's actually the name of an extremist militia. So their members were arrested last week for plotting to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And we have a clip, actually. Michigan's Attorney General Dana Nessel said in an interview, she basically set forth that she believes Donald Trump is more responsible than people are saying for calling for groups like these to take incredibly dangerous criminal actions. Let's listen to what she had to say.
President that traffics in extremism. And I hear the press frequently talk about it in terms of a dog whistle to these groups. But to me, it's not a dog whistle. It's really a command to action.
And, the Los Angeles Times recently featured Casey Miller from the Southern Poverty Law Center getting straight to the heart of what Trump and his enablers, including these extreme far-right militias and white supremacy groups, plan to do on Election Day and in days and weeks after. She wrote that the chances are really high that we're going to see militia members, armed groups, or Trump supporters who are armed at the polls. Not only are these people willing to participate in voter intimidation, but they're hoping to create this chaotic moment. There's an unwillingness to accept anything but a Trump victory. And of course, we all remember the debate.
The debate. I'm still recovering from the debate. That was horrifying and awful to sit through.
Seriously. And he told Proud Boys to, quote, stand back and stand by.
And literally, like immediately that night, these groups started like making merchandise and like T-shirts and stuff using Trump's language. They heard the call from the president. They celebrated the call from the president. And I think the fact that they seemed to know what he meant and be celebrating it was, if anything, to me, confirmation of how dangerous and frightening this is.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't anything new. I mean, look back to Charlottesville when he called people on both sides very fine people.
Yeah, of course, when like heavily armed white supremacist militia groups are the nightmare scenario for like orderly voting at the polls. But it's also like, as I said before, it's deeply problematic when anybody intimidating is trying to make people feel uncomfortable going to their polling place. When we talk about, Florida, 500 some votes deciding the election, it's not a lot of people that need to be intimidated out of voting to completely change the tide of this country. So if ordinary Trump supporters do decide to show up at the polls and harass people who their president told them don't look like they should be allowed to vote, that's exactly the kind of chaos that could cost us the integrity of our democratic process. All of which is to say, the best way to defeat it is to not let them scare you. And we're hoping that good, orderly acknowledgement of this and action on it by people whose job it is to make our polling places safe will be the best thing we can hope for at this point. But to me, it goes back to the theme we were talking about before of one side trying to silence people, which pains me. It's just continues to pain me enormously because I grew up in the Midwest. I understand people disagreeing with each other politically. Our political discourse has gotten to a point of extremity where it is now harder to understand the disagreements in play. But the tactic of trying to silence a portion of the electorate pretty much overtly on the basis of race, but certainly on the basis of belief and culture and socioeconomic status, it is both deeply American. Silencing marginalized people has been a thing since America was born, but it's also just absolutely, I think, should be repellent to anyone who wants to consider themselves someone who is invested in the future of this country.
Mm-hmm. And I think too about how this isn't this sort of tactic of sort of judging somebody's Americanness is something that has sort of heightened in the past 4 years. How many clips have we seen where somebody walks up to a Spanish speaker in a grocery store and tells them to speak English? And it feels very similar. And so what's more is that this sort of voter suppression is such a frighteningly ancient tactic, though. The violence is something we think of as belonging to other places and other times. This tactic of intimidating voters isn't meant to secure a voting place at all. It's not meant to make sure that elections are free and fair. It's meant to create chaos. It's meant to create violence. And it's meant to create this atmosphere because it's exactly, as we've talked about before, part of Trump's broader strategy to actually undermine faith in the election results. Because if we do that, if we do not believe in these election results, it's easier for Trump to steal the election. It makes it easier for him to convince Republican-controlled state legislatures to send fraudulent electors to support Trump as if he won the election.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize where we are right now, we've talked with Professor Douglas, who gave us a sort of chilling rundown on why when Trump says autocratic things and shows us his authoritarian ambitions, we should believe him. And we have now explored the sort of white nationalist groups that consider it their role to intimidate potential voters and silence voters at polling places. I think at this point, the question really is whether, if in the middle of election night chaos, right, there's litigation, there's intimidation, there's endless lines at polling places, vote early, avoid the lines. If in the midst of that, Donald Trump gets on Twitter and calls the election in his own favor, will he be believed? Alana, will he be believed?
Well, there is polling, or there's a growing concern that Trump will declare victory on Election Day, and that if it is close in key swing states, he's going to say that he won the election and try to undermine this electoral process. He's repeatedly stated that the winner of the presidential election will be known on Election Day, even though election officials and voting experts have all said that that's not going to be the case, especially due to the COVID-19 surge in ballots. And Trump has also falsely claimed that these mail-in voting ballots should not be counted because of voter fraud. And he's using it as his rationale for why the winner must be declared on November 3rd. So I mentioned that polling, and Emily, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, a new poll from Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute shows that Republican voters will actually trust a Twitter declaration of victory. if Trump declares himself the winner on election day, especially if Fox News makes the same call. And we now have joining us Jason Gans, Chief of Staff for Data for Progress, who's going to join us and talk with us about the results. Jason, we are so happy to have you here. Welcome. I also notice our shirts match. We did not plan that. We are inadvertently twinning.
Love it.
So Jason, okay, we spoke earlier about the degree to which people who support Donald Trump are kind of living in this media universe that has very little relationship to the rest of ours. And they've been stripped of their trust in the media, and they've been stripped of, rigorous sources of information. And they've come to sort of rely on him personally for their sense of what's happening in the world around them. So now if I'm reading this poll correctly, and you should tell me if I'm not, it seems like Republican voters actually would trust President Trump himself to call the election. Oh, Jason, you're muted. Don't be muted.
Oh man, this is the Republicans want to mute us, but we will unmute ourselves, and we will say that so the Republican voters, 77% of them we're seeing would in fact trust a declaration by Trump on Twitter that he was the victor of the election. So this is obviously a really concerning statistic, and just points to the fact that many of the president's supporters live in an alternate universe where kind of the facts and the reality of our democracy don't matter, which is obviously extremely concerning. I will say the counterpoint is this is not the majority of people, and that overall you find more than half of people, 60% of people, would not really trust this declaration and not go through with it. So it's important to point out that, yes, there's this real contingent of people, and they are a substantial portion of the country, but the people that are actually following this would not trust this from Donald Trump, which is why it's important that our leaders not take their cues from Trump, and that when this happens, if and when this happens, we kind of stand strong and say, no, we have to ensure that every vote is counted.
Alana, you are still, okay, there you are. I'm going to be the mute police. I'm no other kind of police.
So, Jason, as you know all too well, the scenario of President Trump calling the election before an accurate result could be really dangerous. And, with the increased number of mail-in ballots, many of which will be counted after November 3rd, heightens the possibility of what many political scientists call the red mirage, where it appears on election night, because many of the mail-in ballots have not been counted yet, that Trump is ahead in key swing states. And, Trump calling the election is one thing. That's one man. But if Trump calls it, it's likely that some powerful media figures and outlets will call the election too. I mean, let's be honest. Fox News is most likely going to follow Trump.
Tell him about Hannity.
I'm glad you mentioned Hannity, because let's talk about some of the things that that he's saying already. So last week, in an interview with President Trump, Hannity referenced a study from Heritage Foundation that identified nearly 1,000 convictions on voting fraud, he says, and then asked the president whether he was going to encourage his supporters to vote early. The president responded by forecasting big and tremendous fraud this year. Universal unsolicited ballots, Sean. It's going to be a disaster, the likes of which we've never seen. We will never have seen an election like what's going to take place. Thousands of ballots all over the country are being reported. Some thrown in garbage cans without a name on them. Some thrown in trays over the river. What's going on is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and of course there was no backup for this. Tucker Carlson did the same thing. I think the quote was, let's see, if all the votes are counted one night, no one will have time to issue rulings to throw out the ballots they don't like. And that's why judges in Pennsylvania and Michigan want poll workers to count the votes for weeks after Election Day. With their rulings last week, they've made this essentially inevitable. It will be a disaster. We know that for certain. It goes on and on and on. And it's kind of funny because actually we would all like to have a clear result on Election Day. But with the media already employing this rhetoric, what are people going to take from these media declarations on election night, Jason?
So what we're seeing is that generally we find people will trust the media. So particularly Republicans will trust Fox News, and we find that 70% of Republican voters and 50% of voters overall would trust a Fox News declaration, which is concerning because Fox News, as we have seen before, is essentially operating as state-owned media for Donald Trump and cannot really be counted on to act as a neutral actor. And the kind of nightmare scenario would be if Donald Trump declares on Twitter that he won, and then Fox News, following his lead, does that. And then you see whether the kind of more mainstream outlets are pressured into following suit because, you know, everyone loves calling things on election night. We've actually seen races in the past where, due to bugs in the AP feed that drives the reporting, or just people making calls by accident.
Sorry, let me interrupt you. Bugs in the what that drives the reporting?
So there's the AP releases an AP election night feed that drives a lot of the reporting that you see on election night. So most of the major news networks, when you see the votes coming in, precincts reported, counties counted, et cetera, that's all being driven by the AP, which is feeding out this information. And we have seen in the past that this has been, it's mostly reliable, but sometimes there are bugs in it. And so it's very important for everyone, as facts are coming out, as data is coming out, to look at it, to assess it, and to make sure that what you're seeing makes sense and to really get the full story. I will say that there is a scenario where we could know on election night, which is if Biden is able to perform very strongly in Florida or North Carolina or Ohio, then the race is essentially over. So the question for Trump is not can he win the election, but the question for Trump is can he make it close enough to steal it? And our response is clearly no, you cannot. So hopefully we'll be able to make it so that these actors can't kind of maliciously come in and shape the area where it is possible for them to muddle. And we do find that Fox News in particular, with their sway on Republican voters, would be able to make an impact there were they to make the call.
Jason, thank you so much for that phenomenally depressing information. Thank you for joining us to share this. We're going to take some time to absorb that, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you as new polls come out.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take care. Okay, so of everything we've learned on this episode from really brilliant people, I think the thing that is upsetting me the most is the information schism, is not like operating in the same informational world as other people. We just learned that Republican voters overwhelmingly trust Fox News, but not broadcast networks such as CNN. They wouldn't trust a CNN to call the election on election night as much as Fox News. And Republican voters, of course, overwhelmingly trust President Trump. I think it was really interesting what Jason pointed out there, which is that Trump voters would trust a Trump Twitter declaration of victory on election night, but that Trump voters are few enough in number that means that 60% of like all people would not trust a thing. So that is, I suppose, a really interesting detail. But I guess, Alana, my takeaway for this as I think I'm a sane person who values facts, or at least I'm a functional-ish person who values facts and data. It's scary that if Trump were to tweet on election night, I am the winner, I won bigly, that there are like millions of Americans who would just kind of go with that and give local Republican electeds the cover they need to take dramatic action like we talked about last time, like sending a competing slate of electors who were not selected by the people.
Oh, well. So now that you all have made it through this very long and not at all depressing show.
It's useful information.
It's super useful. Let's talk a little bit about sort of what we've learned today on all the reasons we have to be super duper scared, but also need to make sure that we are on our toes. So Trump is telling us that he is going to do anything it takes to claim victory in this election, even if it destroys our democracy. We should believe him. Professor Douglas told us today that Trump fits the profile of an autocrat. And while the GOP has cheated to win election for decades, Trump and his allies are doing some next level nonsense.
I saw your word choice there. I saw you make the choice to use the nice word. I saw your good. Part of the strategy we also talked about is this need to create chaos, perhaps violence and chaos. Sending extremists to quote unquote poll watch. I think Alana put it best, like not the kind of poll watching with the pen and the clipboard, the kind of poll watching with the like weird quasi-military vest and the sidearm. But these intimidation tactics are intended to not only suppress turnout, specifically to silence Black and brown voters, voters from blue districts, low-income voters. This is intended to create the kind of chaos that the very same creators of chaos, the Trump campaign, can then use to claim that the votes cannot be counted, the vote was hopelessly flawed, and we must go with, you know, an appointed set of electors rather than the people's choice. And of course, white nationalist groups are like putting on their fake military regalia and like epaulets as we speak.
Right. But in order to translate this chaos into a fraudulent second term, Trump needs to convince Republican legislatures to send a fraudulent slate of electors. And to do that, he needs his Republican base to call for it. And a new poll from Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute shows that overwhelmingly, if Trump calls the election in his own favor on election night, and especially if Fox News does the same, Republican voters will trust that. And they'll create an atmosphere where they're demanding this election to essentially be stolen.
Okay, so we just got done like soaking in how scary all of this is, but we are actually not telling you this to freak you out. We are telling this to freak you into action, because none of this works. None of this works if there is sufficiently clear turnout and a Biden lead on election day. None of this works. None of this works if there's a landslide against Donald Trump. None of this works if the election results against Donald Trump are so readily apparent that local elected officials just don't have the cover they need to do something as radical as, you know, squashing the will of their voters and appointing their own slate of electoral college appointees. Voting matters, turnout matters. Like it is in your hands. Go vote, drive your parents to vote. Like that's the thing that can basically make all of our fears not come true.
Right, which is why we're giving you all of this information. We know how important it is to have this information because information will give all of us power.
Yeah. Well, that's our show. Thank you for joining us in the fear zone. We're going to look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 4 p.m. We're going to be talking with Brandon Evans about the nitty gritty of what's happening right now in Pennsylvania that could dramatically impact the outcome of this election. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. We'll see you tomorrow.